You may think the most expensive thing on a small homestead is feed or fertilizer, but in my experience, the biggest waste is trying to make every corner work by itself. I did that for years, and every season I spent more money than I wanted while getting less back than I expected. I kept buying bags of feed for chickens hauling water across the garden and wondering why the soil always seemed tired no matter how much work I put into it. Most people believe a pond is only for decoration, or maybe for a few fish on a quiet evening, but that is where the real mistake begins. If your land is missing one small pond, then many parts of your garden are working harder than they need to. I learned this lesson later than I should have, and once I understood it, my whole way of running the property slowly changed without expensive machines or complicated systems. I am not talking about a large lake or a costly project that needs contractors and heavy equipment. I mean a simple pond that becomes the quiet center of everything around it. When I finally stopped looking at it as a hole filled with water and started seeing it as a living helper, my yearly expenses began to fall little by little, and that change surprised even me. I want to show you exactly how this happened because many people over 50 have a garden, or a small piece of land that can still give much more than it does today. You do not need perfect soil, and you do not need a big budget. You only need to understand how one simple place can connect water plants, insects, birds, fish, and even your vegetable beds into something that supports itself much more than most people imagine. An old neighbor explained the first part of this idea to me many years ago, and at that time I smiled politely because I thought he was exaggerating. Later, I realized he was saving himself work while I was creating more work every season. Very few people still use this old way because buying another bag from the store feels easier than changing the system. In the next part, I will tell you why almost everyone chooses the wrong place for a pond, and how that single mistake can keep the whole property from ever working together the way nature already wants it to. Many people think the first step is digging, but that is not where I begin anymore, because the place you choose decides almost everything that comes later. I have seen neighbors spend good money making a beautiful pond only to watch it become a problem because it was too close to large trees or too far from the garden. Then they complain about muddy water, too many leaves, or carrying buckets every day until they stop using it at all. That is why I always tell people to spend more time walking around the property than holding a shovel. I like to stand outside after a rain and simply watch where the water naturally wants to move, because nature is already giving us clues if we are patient enough to notice them. An older farmer showed me this many years ago, and he smiled when he said that water is always trying to teach us something. I did not understand him then, but I certainly do now. Most people make the mistake of fighting the land instead of working with it. If you choose a spot that catches some sunlight, but also has a little shade during the hottest part of the afternoon, you are already making life easier for yourself. You also want the pond close enough that carrying a watering can or running a simple hose does not become another chore you will eventually avoid. I learned that convenience matters more than perfection, because the easier something is, the more often you will actually use it. There is another small detail that many people overlook. Leave enough open ground around the pond instead of placing it tightly between buildings or fences. Before long, birds will begin visiting, insects will appear, and small frogs may even decide to stay. At first, this does not seem important, but these little visitors quietly become part of the system that helps your garden every single day. You do not have to invite them because the water does that for you. Most people never notice how quickly life gathers around even a modest pond. That is the first sign that the place is beginning to work for you instead of asking more from you. But choosing the right location is only the beginning, because the next decision surprises almost everyone. Most people believe the pond should look clean and empty from the first day. I believed that too until an old forgotten method completely changed the way I looked at water and what should actually be living inside it. When I finally dug my first small pond, I made the same mistake that almost everyone makes. I wanted the water to look perfectly clear from the very beginning. Every little leaf annoyed me, and every green shade in the water made me think something was going wrong. I spent time cleaning it when I should have been letting it settle. An elderly man from the next village came by one afternoon and watched me with a smile. He said, "You are working too hard because a healthy pond is not supposed to look empty." At first, I did not believe him, but I decided to stop interfering for a while and simply watch what happened. That turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made on my property. Little by little, the water found its balance. Tiny insects appeared first, and then frogs began visiting during warm evenings. After that, birds started stopping by almost every morning for a drink or a quick bath. It did not happen overnight, but every week I noticed something new. Very few people allow enough time for this because they expect instant results. Nature almost never works that way, but once it begins, it often surprises you. I also learned another forgotten method that older gardeners used without thinking much about it. They never left the edges of the pond completely bare. They planted simple moisture-loving plants around the water. Those plants were not there only because they looked nice. Their roots helped keep the bank stable, and their leaves created places where useful insects could hide. The pond slowly became more than a container of water. It became a home for many small helpers that soon spread across the whole garden. Around that time, I noticed something interesting in my vegetable beds. I was seeing fewer pests than before, and I was no longer reaching for different treatments as often. I cannot say the pond solved every problem, because no garden is ever perfect, but it certainly reduced many of the small struggles that used to take up my weekends. The best part was that I was spending less money while doing less work. That is the kind of improvement I appreciate more every year. Most people never connect these changes because they are looking for one dramatic result instead of many small ones that add up over time. The pond was quietly supporting the entire property without asking for much in return. But there was one more step that made everything work even better, and this is the part that many people skip because it looks too simple to matter. That small decision turned the pond from a pleasant feature into a real source of food and savings, and that is exactly what I want to share next. The moment I stopped treating the pond as something separate from the rest of the property, everything began to change. Until then, I had been thinking about water in one place, vegetables in another place, and chickens somewhere else. I never asked how they could actually help each other. Most people still organize their land that way and then wonder why every season costs more than the last one. An old gardener once told me that every corner of the property should give something to another corner. I remembered those words only after several years, and they made much more sense when I finally saw them working with my own eyes. One of the easiest things I started doing was using pond water for the garden whenever the level was naturally high after rain. I did not empty the pond, and I never took too much. I simply used a little when nature had already provided enough. The vegetables seemed happier, and I was using less tap water during dry periods. It may not sound like much, but over a whole season, those small savings become very noticeable. Then I noticed another forgotten method that many older people used without calling it anything special. They planted useful plants close to the pond instead of decorative flowers only. Mint grew well there. Chives liked the extra moisture. Even a few berry bushes seemed to appreciate that part of the garden. Suddenly, one small area was producing herbs, berries, and helping the insects at the same time. Very few people think about stacking simple benefits like this because they are searching for one big solution, instead of many small ones working together. I also stopped throwing every bit of plant material into a waste pile. Healthy leaves and trimmed stems became light mulch around the pond or compost for later use. Little by little, the property started feeding itself instead of depending on constant purchases. That feeling is difficult to describe until you experience it. You begin to realize that every season requires fewer trips to the store because the land is quietly producing more of what it needs. That is probably the greatest reward for me now that I am older. I would rather spend an extra hour watching the garden than carrying another heavy bag home. Most people think the real value of a pond is the water you can see. I believe the real value is everything happening around it that most people never notice. But there is one simple addition that made the whole system far more productive than I expected, and it cost almost nothing. When I tried that old method, the pond stopped being only a source of water and became one of the most useful parts of the entire property. One small addition changed everything for me, and it was so simple that I almost ignored it when someone first mentioned it. I began adding fish that could comfortably live in a small pond without needing expensive equipment or constant attention. I was not trying to build a business or raise large numbers. I only wanted the pond to become more alive and more useful. That decision slowly connected many parts of the property in ways I had never expected. The fish helped keep small insects under control, and their natural activity supported the balance of the water. I stopped looking at the pond every morning wondering what needed fixing, because there was much less to fix. Most people think they need pumps, filters, and all kinds of costly devices before they can keep fish. In many small ponds, that simply is not true if you start modestly and allow nature to do most of the work. An old friend told me many years ago that the biggest mistake is trying to force the pond to produce too much too quickly. I followed his advice and let everything develop at its own pace. That patience saved me both money and disappointment. There was another old method that impressed me even more. I allowed duckweed and a few other simple water plants to grow in controlled amounts instead of removing every bit of green from the surface. Most people immediately clean them away because they think the pond should always look perfectly open. What they do not realize is that these plants help shade the water during hot weather and create a healthier place for small living creatures. From time to time, I collected part of those plants and added them to the compost or used them around the garden. Nothing was wasted. Little by little, the pond became a place that was constantly producing something useful instead of asking for more work. I also noticed that birds visited even more often than before. They helped reduce insects around the vegetable beds and made the whole garden feel alive from early morning until evening. You cannot buy that kind of balance in a store. It appears when different parts of the property begin helping one another. The greatest surprise was not the fish or the plants themselves. It was how much less I was spending during the growing season. I was buying fewer unnecessary products because the land was quietly doing more on its own. That is the kind of saving that continues year after year. But there was still one final lesson I had to learn, because even a self-supporting system needs one simple habit from its owner. Without that habit, many people slowly lose all the advantages they have worked so hard to build, and that is exactly what I want to leave you with in the final part. The older I get, the more I value simple habits instead of complicated plans because a healthy property does not need constant control. It only needs regular attention. That was probably the last lesson my small pond taught me. In the beginning, I walked around it every day looking for problems. Later, I found myself walking there simply to observe. I would stand quietly for a few minutes in the morning with a cup of tea and notice small changes that many people would never see. A few more frogs than last week, young fish moving close to the edge, birds visiting before the sun became too warm, fresh growth on the plants around the water. Those little signs told me much more than any expensive tool ever could. They showed me that the system was taking care of itself. My job was no longer to interfere with everything. My job was to avoid making unnecessary mistakes. Most people still believe they must constantly improve every corner of the garden, but sometimes the best improvement is leaving a healthy system alone. That is something an experienced neighbor told me many years ago, and only now do I fully understand what he meant. I also learned not to expect perfection, because nature never promises that. One season may bring more rain, while another may be drier than usual. Some years there are more insects and other years fewer. The pond adapts quietly if we do not rush to change everything after the first small problem. That patience has probably saved me more money than any special product I ever bought. I spent less time carrying heavy bags and more time harvesting vegetables, herbs, berries, and enjoying the simple feeling that the property is giving back instead of constantly asking for more. That is especially important as we grow older because our strength becomes more valuable and we learn to use it wisely. If you have been thinking about creating a small pond, do not imagine it as another project that adds work to your life. Think of it as the beginning of a system where water plants, insects, birds, fish, and your garden slowly start helping one another. It does not happen in a week, and it does not require perfection. It happens step by step with simple decisions that almost anyone can make. Very few people still use this forgotten way because modern life teaches us to solve every problem by buying something new. My experience has been the opposite. The more I allowed nature to work with me instead of against me, the less I needed to spend, and the more satisfying each season became. And if there is one thing I hope you remember after listening to my story, it is this. Sometimes the smallest change in the middle of your property quietly becomes the reason everything else begins to work better. That is why I never look at my pond as just a pond anymore. I see it as the quiet heart of the whole garden, and once you experience that for yourself, you will probably never look at your own land the same way again. When I look back now, I sometimes smile because I spent years searching for ways to make my garden produce more while the answer was sitting in front of me all along. I believed I needed more equipment, more fertilizer, and more supplies from the store. What I really needed was to let different parts of the property support each other. That small pond became much more than a place with water. It became the center that quietly connected everything around it. The vegetables benefited from better moisture. Birds and frogs became regular visitors and helped keep many insects under control. The fish became part of the natural balance. The plants around the edge protected the banks and attracted even more useful life. None of these changes looked dramatic on a single day, but over several seasons the difference became impossible to ignore. My yearly expenses became lower because I was buying less and wasting less. I spent fewer hours fixing problems because many of those problems simply stopped appearing so often. That is probably the greatest gift this old method has given me. It replaced constant work with quiet observation. If you are over 50 like me, you begin to appreciate anything that saves both energy and money without making life more complicated. That is exactly what happened here. You do not need a large property, and you do not need perfect conditions. Even a modest piece of land can become far more productive when every part begins helping the others. Most people never experience this because they continue treating the garden, the pond, the chickens, and the fruit trees as completely separate projects. I used to think the same way until experience slowly changed my mind. If I could give only one piece of advice, it would be this. Start small and let nature do more of the work than you think possible. Do not rush to make everything perfect because balance appears little by little. Watch carefully instead of constantly changing things. Give living creatures a reason to stay, and they will often reward you in ways that cannot be bought. That forgotten approach has saved me money every single season and has made working on my property much more enjoyable. I still discover something new almost every year, and that is one of the reasons I never get tired of walking around the pond each morning. If this story encouraged you to look at your own land differently, then I hope you will stay with me, because there are many more simple forgotten methods that can reduce expenses, increase harvests, and make everyday gardening easier than most people imagine.